Good evening. Welcome to this Brennan Center event at New York University School of Law. My name is Melissa Murray. I'm a professor of law here, and I'm also a member of the board of the Brennan Center. The Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute that works to reform and revitalize, and where necessary, defend the systems of democracy and justice. You can follow the Brennan Center's important work online at brennancenter.org, as well as on Facebook and Twitter. This last year, the Brennan Center has worked diligently to address new and alarming assaults on the norms of constitutional democracy, including assaults on the rule of law and the independence of prosecutions and the furtherance of executive power and overreach. Part of that work has included partnering with tonight's guest, Preet Bharara. Preet and former New Jersey Governor Christine Todd Whitman have co-chaired the Brennan Center's National Task Force on the Rule of Law and Democracy. The task force has published a series of proposals intended to relieve the pressures currently threatening our democratic institutions, and we are grateful for Preet for leading that effort. Since serving as the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Preet has become a distinguished scholar in residence here at NYU School of Law. In his spare time, he has created a podcast, Stay Tuned with Preet, and he has written a book, Doing Justice, A Prosecutor's Thoughts on Crime, Punishment, and the Rule of Law. We know that many of you tonight have questions about Preet's record as a prosecutor and the impact that that work has had on communities of color. We welcome your questions, whether they are animated out of admiration or prompted by a more skeptical position. This is a university, and part of a university's shared norms are at the heart of our democracy, a free and spirited and open dialogue. I hope that we can achieve that tonight. To launch this conversation tonight, we are joined by Margaret Hoover, the host of the political show Firing Line on PBS. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Preet Bharara and your moderator, Margaret Hoover. Welcome. It just doesn't count. It doesn't count unless you say it into the microphone. Welcome. Preet Bharara.
Hi.
Thanks for writing a book so we get to talk to you.
You're welcome.
It's Doing Justice, A Prosecutor's Thoughts on Crime, Punishment, and the Rule of Law. It's an auspicious day to have you here.
Am I under oath? Do I have to appear in the House tomorrow?
Is a former U.S. attorney always under oath, just by default of having been a U.S. attorney?
No.
All right. Girl Scouts honor. I am dying to know, just like everybody else, did you watch the hearings today?
I watched them till about 2 p.m., and then I recorded the beginning of what I do every week, the podcast, Stay Tuned, with Preet, available on applepodcast.com.
Have you guys heard?
/Preet.
Preet has a very successful podcast that he launched after being fired by President Trump.
Yes. I like the way you juxtapose successful and fired in the same sentence. That's very well done. My mom will appreciate that. So I watched a lot. I watched about the first 4 hours of it, and it was interesting. You know, a lot of it. Did any folks watch it or see some of the reports? So, what I thought was interesting, among other things, were all the debates about language. And language is important, and one of the most interesting debates, and on lots of different words, including what summary means, what and phrases, what get rid of means, what suggest means, what cooperation means. On summary, it seems like a very sort of pedantic semantic argument, like what's a summary? And you'll recall that the report was delivered confidentially from the Mueller report from the special counsel's office to the Attorney General, William Barr, on a Friday, March 22nd, I guess. And then 2 days later, Bill Barr provided a letter to the public and to the Congress that he kept saying, 4 pages, based on a 448-page report, which he kept saying was not a summary, but it was something in which he merely summarized the principal conclusions. But he was very adamant. It's not a summary. It's not a summary. And I kept not understanding, like, why was it so important not to call it a summary? And then, as we learned last night from reporting, and then we got the copy this morning, there were not one but two letters sent by Special Counsel Mueller saying, we got some summaries.
Right.
Why don't you use ours? And so just the final point is, I feel like the reason, in part, that he was having the semantic addiction to not calling it a summary was he wanted to be able to say, I don't want any summaries, and mine was not a summary, and Mueller's was, and we're not doing summaries, and if you understand that, then you're a lot smarter than I am.
So were you surprised when you saw, maybe you saw the report hit at 7 last night, maybe you saw it first thing in the morning, were you surprised that Robert Mueller went to the trouble to write a letter to Barr and then to leak it the day before Barr went up to the Hill?
Well, I don't know that he leaked it.
Well,
I know that's been,
it was
do you know?
conveniently placed in the press's hands, and
Well,
right before, regardless of whether Mueller did it or not, were you surprised to learn that Robert Mueller wrote this letter because he was concerned about Barr's non-summary?
Yeah, and it's a summary.
So does that seem to you,
It does, because
from what you know about Robert Mueller, to be
I know
out of
him some,
character?
I know him personally and professionally, and but people who know him a lot better than I do all said it's a very unusual step for him. And as Barr himself, I think, said in testimony today, he said, what's with the letter? Why don't you just call me? When people write a letter, they're not just doing it to make their point to the recipient of the letter in the moment. They're doing something for posterity, and they're making a record.
They want the trail.
Yeah, they want the trail, and I don't think. And by the way, it's not just one letter; it was two letters. As we now have learned, on Sunday the 4-page non-summary summary thing comes out. On Monday, Bob Mueller transmits his own actual summaries that could have been released, and then on Wednesday, the letter that was released this morning, he says, you know what, you've left a misimpression. I don't have the exact phraseology in front of me. So he did it twice.
Yeah.
On top of having a conversation, I think he thought it was a big deal. And the weird thing about it also is that I think that letter speaks for itself and shows that Bob Mueller was very concerned about what the public's reaction was and their understanding of what the report was going to be all about, because there would be this delay before the full report would be brought forward to the public. And he didn't want to let it lie. And I think that's an incredibly significant thing.
Do you, based on what you saw today, believe that Attorney General Barr misled the American people about the contents of the Mueller report?
So there's various verbs you can use. I was asked on television today, did he perjure himself? Because there are these exchanges you have that happen.
Let's go with misled, and then we'll get to perjure.
So I don't. We're going to go in that direction?
Yeah, we're going to warm up to it.
Look, I think he wasn't forthright. I think he wasn't on. The standard. It's funny. All day today, it seems like every senator was asking questions that went to the issue of whether or not a crime was committed, as opposed to whether or not a bad thing was done. And you would think the standard for the President of the United States is something less than a crime, a provable beyond a reasonable doubt felony. And so when you ask this question about Attorney General Barr, you teach assistant U.S. attorneys who are, I think, a little bit lower than the Attorney General. When you get a direct question from the court, the kinds of answers he gave would have a judge calling me probably to say, you had a prosecutor in my courtroom today, and he was technically, I guess, correct and parsing his words very carefully, but he was trying to mess around with the truth and with the words, and I won't tolerate. Very few judges would tolerate the kind of rhetoric and, I think, lack of transparency that was shown by the Attorney General today.
So in your book, Doing Justice, you say, in the end, law doesn't do justice, people do. So to that end, is the Attorney General of the United States doing justice?
In connection with, there's a lot of things that the Attorney General does and oversees. With respect to the thing that we're seeing now, how he dealt with the Mueller report, how he dealt with questions about the Mueller report, how he has inserted himself on the issue of whether the president did or did not obstruct justice. On all of those things, I think given what his role is supposed to be, one of being the attorney for everyone as opposed to sort of, a PR specialist for the president or the president's personal lawyer, I think he's deviated from his role.
So what's the remedy for that? I mean,
You
you
know-
don't, you're not willing, I'm surmising you're not willing to say that he's perjured himself.
No, I'm not saying that, and I wouldn't say that from
And perjury
from
is quite complicated, as I understand it anyway, that but
Well,
so
perjury also requires, and no, no offense to any members of the Congress, perjury requires asking, very deft, specific questions and follow-up questions, so there's no doubt about the meaning of what was asked, and there's no doubt about the meaning of what was said in reply. And I watched some of the testimony today, and I watched some of the playback, and it was played back for me on television also. And yeah, there was the word misleading, and I'll adopt that. As you saw Barr do today, there are ways to explain why you thought the question asked for X, and you answered Y. I think it takes a little bit more to show that a crime is committed. You say, what is the remedy? There can be political accountability. He was confirmed on a party line vote. It's not a lot you can do to deal with an attorney general. Lots of folks, including people who are in politics and who are running for president, have called for his resignation. As of today, I don't know that will amount to anything. I think the president is very happy with how his attorney general is representing him, and I don't think he wanted to fire Mueller over and over and over again. I don't think he's going to do that with Attorney General Barr. I think if you want a remedy for either that or anything else, then you need to do something different at the ballot box in 2020.
So it's your view then that constitutionally the ultimate check on an attorney general that has no impartiality from the chief executive of the United States is at the ballot box. It's the people rather than any functioning of government within the executive branch.
Look, it can be. When I was in the Senate some years ago working on the Senate Judiciary Committee staff, we opened an investigation that was done on a bipartisan basis but involving the Justice Department and the politicization of the Justice Department, how they were doing hiring, and ironically, the firing of U.S. attorneys back in 2007. And because there was a bipartisan basis for not having confidence in then Attorney General Alberto Gonzales, at some point in the summer of 2007, he went on his merry way, along with the Deputy Attorney General, the Attorney General's Chief of Staff, and a number of other people.
At the
So that
discretion
can
of the
happen.
president, who felt that he had lost the confidence of the American people in the Senate.
Yeah.
And
So that's how it can happen politically, but I didn't see today any Republican senator voice anything but admiration and support for Bill Barr.
in fact, there's one Republican senator. We're just going to do a little bit of political analysis today, and then we're getting to the book, because this is all part of the book as well, because it's about doing justice. But there was one Republican senator today that said, it's over, isn't it? And then he went into this, we've got to investigate the investigators.
Are you talking about Lindsey Graham?
I'm talking about Lindsey Graham.
Yeah. He dropped the F-bomb on national television. Did you see that? I won't do that tonight.
So I was going to say, it gives you all sorts of runway. I mean, what is the danger or, your view, frankly, of that path being pursued, investigating the investigators?
Look, the worry is, look.
Because I think that's going to happen. I mean, I think they're
Yeah.
going that. I mean, do you think that there are real challenges and problems with the FISA warrant? Did that come through your office when you were?
I don't talk about what did or did not. FISA warrants are handled by Main Justice in the National Security Division, and there's a FISA court in Washington. We don't.
So it's not
use-
part of your jurisdiction at all. You didn't deal with
we
that
didn't.
at all.
We
You
don't do
didn't have
FISA.
anything?
We don't do
Great.
FISAs.
So
But look, there are reasonable bases and good faith bases for doing lots of different things. The problem is, if it looks like, and it is, based on political retaliation against rivals in politics, and it looks like a vendetta as opposed to a good faith inquiry into whether or not people have committed misconduct, then that's, I think, a huge problem. A lot of these things that people are talking about have been examined. There were lots of readbacks of the texts that are bad. They're problematic and they're not good. Between Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, a lot of that has already been the subject of an Inspector General report. Both of those people testified at length before Congress. So I don't know what further thing needs to happen there other than a deflection from things that are happening now with respect to the president. No one should be able to escape investigation or accountability or liability just because they happen to be in a position to be able to claim this is a political vendetta. You have to worry about that also. But when it looks like a political vendetta, when you have lots of evidence that Donald Trump, the President of the United States, has taken people aside and said privately to them, can you lay off this person like Michael Flynn because he's a friend of mine and an ally of mine, or could you go after so-and-so because they're an adversary of mine, well, then that doesn't give you a lot of confidence that these things are being undertaken in good faith. And the idea that the fact that an investigation didn't end up with an outcome where a special counsel says that a crime has been committed, and part of that reason is because you have this Office of Legal Counsel opinion that says you can't indict a president. The fact that you didn't end up with an outcome that said crime cannot, in I think, an orderly society, in a fair society, necessarily mean that the investigation was corrupt at the outset, because it can't be the case that prosecutors and investigators think, well, unless we end up with a charge at the end, people are going to say this whole thing was nonsense, and then we should be investigated also. That can't be the result either.
So one more question with respect to the Mueller report, and that's that it seems that Mueller sidestepped the opportunity to look at the president's finances. And the two questions I have for you, one...
Do we know that? Do we know that for sure?
Well, in all the unredacted parts,
Yeah.
right? So do you think that he did and it was redacted?
No, I don't know.
Do you...
I don't know. Well, because Bill Barr was asked today, point blank, if Bob Mueller reviewed certain aspects of Donald Trump's finances and whether he had reviewed Donald Trump's taxes, and he said he didn't know. So if he doesn't know, then I don't know.
That's not necessarily true. As the former U.S. Attorney of the Southern District of New York, I mean, do you suspect that other jurisdictions will explore the opportunity to review the president's tax returns and finances?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable to expect. I think probably my old office, with which I don't have any personal knowledge anymore, and haven't for 2 years. The reporting is that they're looking at the Trump Organization, and they're looking at things relating to the inaugural committee. The state attorney general in New York has been looking at the Trump Foundation and filed a petition in connection with the Trump Foundation. And there's lots of things to look at, so I imagine they will be. And those other offices, U.S. attorney's offices or state attorney general's offices, will not be cabined and constrained in the same way that special counsel Bob Mueller was, because his mandate was very specific and his ambit was very narrow, and these other offices are not. It also, means that those kinds of things, if they lead to fruit, they may not. People can look and they see smoke, but they may not find fire, and then you walk away. But those things are harder to shut down. That's sort of the next obvious question that you were probably going to ask. How does it work? It's a little bit harder, although it's possible, I guess. It's a little bit harder for someone sitting very high up, like the Attorney General, to reach into into a local U.S. Attorney's office who, let's say hypothetically, is on the verge of seeking an indictment against someone who's an affiliate of or an associate of or maybe even a relative of the sitting president, and it's a good faith indictment based on financial transactions or something else, and for that person like Bill Barr to say, no, don't do that, I think there would be a lot of objection to that, and there could be resignations, and there could be noisy resignations, and I think you would get a congressional inquiry. It's just a lot harder to stop something in its tracks if it has had a natural, good faith life that unfolds in a local U.S. Attorney's office. That's all.
All right. So I'd like to get to the book because, I mean, maybe you had been thinking about writing a book for years, but truthfully, you wrote this book because you had a little bit of time on your hands that you didn't expect to have, because the President Trump, after being elected, phoned you and said he was going to keep you on, and then
he had me over to his place. His office.
Right. You mean to Trump Tower? You mean to Trump Tower?
Yes, it's kind of his place. The 26th floor of Trump Tower. It's very
gold,
a lot of gold.
It's 100% his place.
Yeah. It's like his pad, I think, right?
It's his pad. And so he had you over, so you went when he was president-elect.
I did.
And then he becomes the president, and he calls you on the phone, and this is in March or so, and you don't call him back.
Correct.
And you don't call him back because?
So he called me a couple of times when he was the president-elect, which I thought was odd and peculiar, because he's hopefully busy, learning, going to president's school, and I have a particular kind of jurisdiction in the Southern District, including Trump Foundation, the Trump Organization, his pad certainly, and Obama never called me, and I served under him for over 7 years. So you're wondering what's up, and various people have said from time to time, well, the president doesn't understand protocols. Donald Trump has not been in government before. He doesn't get it. He hasn't read the memos that the Justice Department promulgates about these things. And what I said to them in response is, I told both my deputies in the Southern District about those phone calls. I told the head of transition for the Justice Department for Trump about those phone calls. And I also told my dad. And my dad is now, then, 78-year-old Indian immigrant, retired pediatrician from New Jersey, and I believe has not read any of the promulgated guidelines. And when he found out that the president-elect was calling me, he says, "I don't like that." So he understood that doesn't seem good that he's calling you. But I thought it was all, and I advised everyone, and nothing untoward was said. We shot the breeze. He was like, "What's up, Preet? He called me 2 days before the inauguration, when I thought, like, don't you have a speech that you got to write?
Steve Bannon was working on it.
He claimed, it's funny, he said, apropos of nothing and without my asking, he said, yes, I can't do an impression of him, I'm sorry. He said, yes, I'm writing it all myself. He felt the need to say that to me, and he said, and it's all about unity. Do you remember the Carnage speech?
This American Carnage. Yeah. All right, so
then we get to, I'm sorry, so then we get to, so then he becomes the president. And it's March 9th, it's a Thursday, and I get a message from the White House secretary of the president saying the president would like you to return the call. And then I paused. And I called to my deputy, June Kim, and we discussed, what do you do? And it seems odd, I think, to people who have bosses, and particularly people who are responsible for being in your position, which Donald Trump was for me, at least staying on, like you call the boss back. Not so simple as that in the Justice Department. And this is before I knew about these weird conversations that he had with Jim Comey about Michael Flynn and about loyalty and all these efforts to say that, Jeff Sessions should unrecuse himself and his job is to protect me. And now, even in recent times, these reports that my successor, Jeff Berman, should unrecuse himself. So ostensibly or hypothetically, he could protect Donald Trump or Donald Trump's personal lawyer, Michael Cohen. But you have an inkling about these things. And I thought it's not going to go well whether it's an innocent conversation or not, because what are people going to think of this side, to the side call that was not done through protocols, it was not done with the Attorney General. The Attorney General clearly had no idea that the president was calling me, and I thought no good can come of it. And so I didn't return the call, and 22 hours later I was asked for my resignation. I can't connect those things for certain, but they seem unlikely not to be connected.
You can't snub the President of the United States, I suppose, not this one. So you have this time on your hands, and you write a book, and the book is, you have every opportunity to make it a Trump book, or to make it sort of a review and a criticism of the Trump administration, or how
There's a lot of those books.
And you decided not to do that. Instead, what you did is you wrote really an ethical primer on making the right calls in the justice system. People who are going through the justice system and what they encounter, what you encounter in the course of a case from the beginning to end. And it's really about morality, because doing justice is about the right people making the right calls, and that's when you have justice in the criminal justice system. Where did you get your moral compass?
To the extent I have one, I think from my parents. So if you read the acknowledgments, and I have a lot of people to thank and a lot of people to acknowledge, and the very last paragraph of the acknowledgments, even after my kids and my wife, are my parents, who, if there are any South Asian immigrants in the audience, you might appreciate that they wanted me to be a doctor, not a lawyer. And I say, my mom and dad never especially wanted, and my brother also became a lawyer, and then we both married lawyers, so it's very disappointing to my parents. They never especially wanted us to become lawyers, but the first people from whom I think my brother and I learned about principles and about justice and fairness was from my parents, not because they taught it, not because it was their profession, but because they modeled those things, those virtues and those values every day. So I think it was them. And then I had great teachers, and then I had other mentors, after that in the law.
So you write, false allegations, wrongful convictions, excessive punishments, miscarriage of justice are often wholly the result of human failing, not flaws in the impersonal machinery of justice. So one of the elephants in the room tonight is a recent CUNY law report that details the Bronx 120 raid, which happened when you were U.S. Attorney. Can you tell us what the Bronx 120 rate was so that the audience is
Yeah, so
familiar with the
Yeah, so,
story?
and I appreciate there are people who, look, another chapter in the book, let me take a couple of minutes on this. So another chapter in the book deals directly with criticism that you have to face if you do anything, I think, that's significant. And certainly if you're a prosecutor, you can face criticism. And I've faced, and my office has faced criticism of being too tough and not tough enough, depending on your perspective, depending on the case, and sometimes in the same case. People thought we didn't go far enough or we went too far. And there have been allegations about, motivations about why you do things. I was banned from Russia because of a case we brought against Victor Bout.
Banned from Turkey as well.
I'm not
Not banned
officially
from Turkey?
banned from Turkey, but
You
I
had
think
President you had
President
Erdogan
Erdogan tried to get
asking
me
for your
fired.
firing.
Yes, I detail a set of circumstances in which, in a very serious way, in the country of my birth, accusations that I purposely targeted people of South Asian descent, Indians, in this country and elsewhere, for prosecution because I was somehow self-loathing and wanted to prove something, according to one article, to my white masters, presumably Eric Holder and Barack Obama. So criticism is part of the job and part of the lay of the land. Donald Trump didn't make up witch hunt. I actually had an assistant compile all the times that significant targets had said witch hunt, and it would have elongated the book by double. So the fact that people have a criticism, I think, is okay, and you have to have a good and honest debate. What I worry about with respect to criticism is if it spawns, I think, suggestions not based on evidence, like some of these accusations from the country of my birth, that a particular action was taken or intended for racist reasons or for personal gain. I mean, there have been all sorts of accusations about how we handled the financial crisis or didn't handle accountability in the financial crisis. And so the first thing I'll say is, the people that I know, the professionals, either the NYPD or the FBI or the DEA or in my own office, in every case that I'm aware of, and they made mistakes. And by the way, I'm very honest in the book about things that maybe we didn't do perfectly, maybe things that I overstated and I shouldn't have. I got rebuked by a judge. I talk about that. I don't shy away from it. But in my experience, whether you believe it, but people believe it or not, on the Bronx 120 case or anything else, the intentions were good, and people were acting in good faith. And like in a lot of places in New York, the overall crime rate, as that CUNY report suggests, and the related Intercept article suggests, the overall crime rate in the country has gone down. And so that's causing, I think correctly, a good and honest rethinking about how we go about dealing with crime and how we go about dealing with punishment. But there are still places where crime is a huge problem. One of the first things I did when I was U.S. Attorney was go to Newburgh, New York, that had a significant gang problem. In fact, the homicide rate in Newburgh, New York, a little bit north of the city, was 4 times what it was anywhere else in New York. And I met with the community, the first community meetings I had, and I met with moms, and all African-American moms, who said, you have to do something here. And the first mom I remember meeting in a setting at a community center said, I lost a son to gang violence. And she's telling the story, and people, grown men and women are crying in the room. And then the next mom speaks, and I'm thinking, what could be worse than what the first mom said? And the second mom says, I lost 2 sons. So, the people in that room, I'm getting to the main point in a second, but I think the preface, is important so people understand where I'm coming from. And you can disagree, and people can have heated arguments, and that's all fine. But I want people to understand where we're coming from. And the people in that room in Newburgh, New York, we're not talking about Eastchester Gardens yet, committed themselves to taking serious action. And we brought big gang cases, and we did big takedowns of Crips and Bloods in Newburgh because the community was crying out for it, and because we cared about the victims in the community who were also people of color. Yeah, the people who were charged were people of color and members of gangs and associates of members in gangs and other enablers of them. But the interest was in helping the community and making it safer.
So just so people know, the Bronx 120 was, it occurred 3 years ago, and it was the largest gang raid in New York City's history, and it swept up 120 members of gangs who.
Well, so one of the criticisms is they were not all members of gangs. And as the announcement said, and as the indictment makes clear, there were some people who were members of gangs and associates of gangs, members and associates. In the same way, and people can criticize the rhetoric, in the same way that when we have done large mafia takedowns, you charge some people who were made members of the mob and then also their associates and people who were involved in criminal activity as well. So I appreciate the criticism that, some of the rhetoric that surrounded that criminal action made it seem like every single person was a member of a gang, and there was a taint on the part of folks who are maybe not as criminally liable as the people at the top. But
do you think it's possible that individuals were swept up in that gang raid that actually weren't not only just violent criminals, but weren't that shouldn't have been?
So I should issue another caveat. So I was fired 10 months after that case. I don't have access to the docket. I don't know what all the dispositions are. I can't argue sort of, line by line and case by case as to what happened in every particular instance. And so I think the Southern District of New York, should respond and people should ask them what's going on. So I have some top line views, and that is, I'm not aware of anything in any of those cases where somebody was charged who didn't commit the crime. I think there might have been a couple of cases. I think there might have been a couple of cases where prosecutors decided not to pursue. But again, I don't know all the details of this because I'm not there anymore. I don't know what the dispositions have been. And also, by the way, as in any case of this size, it takes a while for the outcomes to be determined, and things might still be under seal. Is it true that the most culpable person was as culpable, that the least culpable person was as culpable as the topmost person? No, of course not. But the situation that the NYPD came to us about, and that members of the community came to us about, and that law enforcement was discussing, was a highly increased rate of crime, and not just regular, violent crime, in a section of the Bronx, where I think there were 8 murders that had gone unsolved. 6 of them ended up becoming solved because of the cases that we brought, and that's why that was done. Now, I think another criticism that is a perfectly valid discussion to have is why is law enforcement doing a takedown of that size in the first place? And what does it mean for communities of color? That's a legitimate discussion to have. What I want people to understand is whether it's right or wrong, and it's a debate to be I think, welcomed, is why does law enforcement do that in any instance? It is an article of faith, and maybe even a fetish on the part of law enforcement, that deterrence works. And maybe some evidence shows it does, some evidence shows it doesn't. But in lots and lots of contexts, at the Justice Department and elsewhere, there is a view that if you do a one-off case, if there's a robbery problem somewhere, or there's a public corruption problem, or there's a healthcare fraud problem, that you arrest somebody in January, arrest another person in February, arrest 5 people in March, nobody gets the message, and nobody is deterred. And so it has become standard operating procedure at DA's offices and at the Department of Justice also, again, whether you agree or not agree, to try to figure out ways when you think that there's a problem of crisis proportions to do large takedowns. We have done it with the mob 1,000,000 times. The Department of Justice would send around missives to all the U.S. Attorney's offices when they wanted to make a statement and have a deterrent effect in healthcare fraud, for example. And they would say, if you've got any healthcare fraud case, could you please plan to either speed it up or pause it, if it's ready already, until, say, May 1 of the following year, so that we can announce to the world, Eric Holder and United States attorneys all around the country would say, we've had enough of this problem of healthcare fraud. And I'm not meaning to compare the prosecutions in the Bronx to healthcare fraud. What I'm trying to explain is a law enforcement tool and strategy that is used in those kinds of cases, in mob cases, in gang cases, and otherwise. And there may be legitimate reason to say, well, if you sweep up everybody all at once, whether it's healthcare or it's the mob or it's a gang case, there's some people who maybe are undeserving of that appellation of being in a gang, even if you're careful in the indictment to say, well, some people are gang members, some people are associates. But the intent of it, as I've said a couple of times now, was to try to reduce crime and try to reduce the feeling of public safety hazard in those communities.
So I think that the question, some of the criticisms that I read today are, is that technique a sledgehammer rather than a scalpel? And is there a way to refine that technique in a way that it might be more precise so as not to ensnare entire communities or groups of young men?
Yeah, look, I think that's
in a way that cripples communities.
Yeah, I think that's a discussion to have. Well, you say cripples communities.
The reason I said that is that there was an op-ed in the Gothamist today about a father who absolutely conceded that gang violence exists and that criminal law enforcement has to help with that. He lost a daughter to gang violence, and then he also lost a son in this roundup of the Bronx 120, and who's now stuck in the criminal justice. I think he ended up pleading out to conspiracy to sell marijuana. And so there's two sides of the coin here, and of course the criminal justice system is imperfect.
No, by the way, the criminal justice system, I say often that no serious social or medical or even public safety problem is ever going to be solved purely by prosecution, whether that's the opioid crisis, corruption on Wall Street, corruption in Albany, or anything else. There's lots of causes and lots of issues, and sure, we should always be thinking about better ways to do things. There are always circumstances in which you can decide to do one thing versus another thing. But another thing to consider, I understand the report had, various analyses of things that happened, I think, without complete information. But one important metric you would think that I don't believe was addressed, and maybe law enforcement had it wrong, maybe they had it right, but I don't believe it was addressed. What was the level of crime before that case was taken down? And what was the level of crime and the feeling of safety after that case was taken down? It would seem to me that if you're really talking about all the issues relating to crime, that's something to consider also.
The structure of your book, it's structured in 4 parts: inquiry, accusation, judgment, and punishment. So it mirrors the trajectory of any case that you litigate as a prosecutor. And in the inquiry section, you had a fascinating anecdote about your personal relationship with the Menendez brothers trial. And
I didn't kill them. That sounded worrisome.
We come to learn, surprisingly, that actually the Menendez brothers were the ones who viciously murdered their parents. But you had a personal connection to this case, and it taught you one of the seminal lessons that you talk about in doing justice. So tell us about how are you tied to this case?
So indirectly, and it's the first chapter after the introductory chapters in the book. And somebody once asked me, when I was thinking about writing the book, was there something that happened in your life before you went to law school that has informed how you think about being the U.S. attorney and how you think about criminal justice? And I hadn't thought about it in a long time, and I remember the story of the Menendez brothers, and the reason it came up was my best friend in high school is a woman named Jessica Goldsmith Barzilai. And she was a year behind me, and we became very, very close. She's my best friend to this day, oldest and best friend. You should maintain friendships with people you went to high school with. And I had heard about her family's best friends growing up, Jose and Kitty. And Jessica's family and Jose and Kitty's family, they lived like near each other in New York City when they were young and tried to make things happen. And I had heard about their boys, Eric and Lyle, for a long time, for years, through high school. And one day Jessica calls me up in the summer before my senior year after my freshman year of college, I guess it was, and she says, Kitty and Jose have been killed. And not just killed, but massacred with shotguns so badly that Jose's head was almost severed from his body. And she was crying hysterically on the phone. Her parents are very upset. And we had a discussion about, who could have done this. And the police thought it was a mob hit because of the violence of it. And Jose had been in the Hollywood industry, and they had some reason to think maybe it was that. And to cut a long story short, and you'll read this in the book, dutifully, hopefully, is every couple of months she would call and there'd be some development in the case. And at some point, she called and said, well, they arrested the boys. How could they have gotten it wrong? And we discussed, how it is that the police can sometimes get cases wrong. And then a few months later, she called and said, well, it turns out that the boys are admitting that they killed their parents, but they're pleading self-defense of some sort. And that's the night that I describe in the book at some length, how we literally talked from night till dawn. And the questions Jessica had were not, what's the criminal penalty, what's the viability of the defense? The question was a very human one. And it was, these were my family's best friends. And we went to the memorial service, and the kids were very upset. What did we miss? Like, what was happening in that family that it could be true that these boys, one of whom Jessica always said she had a crush on, don't tell her I told you that. How could it be that, what did she miss about that family that they could kill their parents. And by the way, it was not an instant, as many people follow the story, it didn't happen sort of in the heat of the moment. It was a meticulously planned parricide, after which the brothers did lots of things that led the police to them, including spending their inheritance money. And it taught, I think, me and her, although she didn't enter the law, an important but very shattering lesson. You can never really know another person. And I think I say something in the book, sometimes it's the case that all evidence and intuition to the contrary, the privileged sons of millionaires massacre their parents. And so I think about that, and maybe this is not good, but in a certain line of work, I think it is. When people say, so-and-so, I don't think those people did it. I always think about the Menendez brothers, and you have to drill down further.
In the accusation part, one of the critiques that's come out in the conversations about your book has been an angst from some who wished there had been more justice done to those who were involved and most responsible for the financial crisis in 2008. But one of the things you talk about in your book is walking away when there isn't enough evidence.
Yeah, so there's a whole chapter called Walking Away, and I think we're discovering the reaction in the public psyche when people pin all their hopes on a prosecutor.
Has that happened recently?
It happened, I think, recently, yes. I wrote a piece for Time Magazine about Bob Mueller last year in which I described, and I have a similar phrase in the book about ways in which some people treated me. Prosecutors, again, they have a binary function, right? You charge or not charge, and you've heard that word a lot. And you said earlier, it's a very blunt instrument. And it's actually not possible to do perfect justice with prosecution, because sometimes people do bad things and it's not enough to charge them. Sometimes people get away with things also. But you can only do what the law permits. You can't go beyond what the law permits. And so sometimes the hardest thing in the world is believing that people acted recklessly or negligently or corruptly or greedily and acted in scummy ways, to use an official legal term. But if there's not enough evidence to prove criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt, then you can't bring the case. And sometimes it takes other mechanisms in society to cause people to be accountable. And that's true when you're talking about Donald Trump, if you think he's guilty of obstruction of justice. And it can also be true in matters like the financial crisis.
So you talk about, a lot of reading the book is getting a sense of what it's like to be Preet Bharara and what it's like in the courtroom. And you have this moment where you describe while you're waiting for a verdict. It's a verdict of a very high-profile hedge fund manager who was convicted of insider trading. Yeah. Not to give away what the verdict was. But it was well known, and you tell a story about it, and also how your family internalized that.
Yeah. So, look, and I'm going to go back to the question you were asking earlier about the criticism. Part of what's revealed in that CUNY report and in the accompanying Intercept article is, I think, a deep human discussion of the impact of prosecution on individuals, on people who get charged. And to the extent people think prosecutors don't care about that, if there's a prosecutor who doesn't care about that and doesn't feel that, then they're in the wrong line of work. And part of what I do in that chapter on the verdict is I describe, what it's like at the moment of conviction. At the moment of conviction, it's a sad moment. It means that the only reason prosecutors have their jobs is because society is imperfect and there are people who do bad things. And orderly society has determined that in some of those cases, a judgment has to be rendered of guilt by their fellow citizens, and then also maybe separation from liberty. What's more awful than that? It's a terrible thing. So I just wanted to make that point. With respect to verdicts generally, I tell the story because people get nervous about verdicts. One good thing about the American system, even though prosecutors have a high rate of conviction, you never know what's going to happen. I've had cases where I expected a conviction, it didn't happen, and cases where this is a very close case, and it could go either way, and the opposite happens. And so there was a matter of the U.S. versus Rajaratnam, who was one of the first big insider trading cases we brought after an indictment in 2009, And the jury was at 11 days, which is a really long time. And obviously, the prosecutors were very, nervous. A lot of people were saying, well, maybe the case hadn't gone in well. And on the 11th day, the jury comes back with a guilty verdict. It was fairly early in my tenure, and everyone was gratified about that because we thought that the person should be convicted. And then the next day, the New York Times writes a story about my tenure as U.S. attorney, and it says some nice things, and there's a nice picture. And so I went and I bought, 45 copies of the Times, and I brought them home. And my daughter at the time was 10, and I never asked her to do this before. She hasn't even read the book yet. But she's 10 years old, and I thought, it's a fairly easy to read article, and it's kind of nice about her dad. And I said, honey, why don't you read this? And she said, okay. And she's bespectacled, and she's very precocious, and so she reads the article. At the end of the article, she pauses, and I can see her sort of like squint, and she's looking at the last line. The last line is me saying some, prosecutorial finger-pointing stuff about how, Wall Street, we're not done, something like that. And she looks up at me, and I'm like looking at her expectantly to see what nice thing she's going to say. And she says, Daddy, why are you such a drama queen? So when you ask, how do you keep humility, one way is to have a daughter like that.
Have children. So you've prosecuted, Wall Street tycoons, Osama bin Laden's son-in-law, Somali pirates, Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda assassins, terrorists and paid assassins. Against the breadth of all the cases that you've prosecuted, what gets your juices flowing the most? What is the most exciting for you or the most gratifying?
So, I'm going to object to the premise of the question because at least the first part
You don't get excited by your work?
Well, you shouldn't get your juices flowing, I think, if you're a prosecutor. I mean that. Like, if you're...
What excites you the most?
I'm just trying to understand how you're... I just want to make it clear...
What's the most gratifying?
I'll tell you what's the most gratifying, and it's another area where I got in a little trouble once. What's most gratifying in some ways is to be in a position to pursue cases and hold people accountable who really should know better and who really hold the public trust and whose crimes are really, really galling. And those would be your elected officials. Because we brought a lot of cases that I think were very important and held a lot of people accountable, including powerful people, not everyone that people would want, but a lot. And the times where people would stop me in the street, and even the CSOs, the court security officers in my own office building, were when we brought cases against politicians in Albany. Because everyone thinks, you know what? Everyone likes to cheat. You represent us. And a public corruption crime is one, whether you vote or not, it affects you. Whether you care about politics or not, it affects you. Whether you're a Democrat or Republican, no matter who the politician is who represents you in your district, it affects you. And so you have no choice but to be affected by that. And there's already a lot of, I think, disillusionment with politicians because they're not doing their job, as a lot of people think, and they engage in, a certain kind of behavior that people don't love. And then on top of that, if you're lining your pockets because you got elected to office, that's really, really upsetting to people. And so that's gratifying. And a couple of things in particular that we did, innovations that we had, it is the case under the New York State Constitution that if you get removed from office, if you serve in Albany, even if you're convicted of a crime, you get to take your pension that you guys pay for, till you die. And we figured out a way under the law, again, some people criticize this also, through criminal forfeiture to take back those pensions. You know what? That was pretty gratifying.
I mean, I was personally gratified. I mean, not many U.S. attorneys have taken down the sitting chair head of the assembly and the majority leader of the state senate, and both of them were, I don't know if I'd call them equally corrupt, but both of them were deeply corrupt. And your office
and one a Democrat,
brought them to justice.
And one a Democrat, and one a
was
Republican.
A Democrat, and one was a Republican.
It's important for people to understand in this, I think, heightened, politicized moment when there are accusations that people bring cases against those who are their political adversaries. and vice versa, that here in New York, my office prosecuted and continues to Democrats and Republicans alike based on their conduct, not based on their affiliation.
We're going to go to questions from the audience, and I have lots of awesome questions here on these note cards, so we're going to start with a fun one. Hey, Preet.
Hey.
We're going to reenact your, like it's your podcast. Hey, Preet. Who would your top 3 candidates be if you could make nominations to the Supreme Court? Thanks, Dave Kozlowski. Dave would like to know.
I can't name particular humans, but I'll say, I'll say, so this is a slight dodge. I would nominate somebody who didn't go to Harvard or Yale, for one.
Stanford, too? Will you include Stanford in that?
Yeah, screw Stanford. No, I'm kidding. I love.
You went to Columbia.
I went to Columbia Law School. But I think first of all, we need more women on the court. There's that great line, right, that I saw recently. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was asked. I forgot exactly how it goes, but how many women on the court? How many women do there need to be on the court to make you happy? And she said 9. Which I thought was a great line. But then something else I think is important. I think Sandra Day O'Connor, I didn't agree with everything that she wrote and all of her opinions, but great justice and a great American. And she had experience not only as a jurist and as a practicing lawyer, but as a politician. She served in the state legislature. And I think what you have now in the court is you have a lot of people who are they're all smart, but they've all had the same kind of experience. They've all come through and been, some version of academic or jurist or practiced appellate law. Not that many of them have really been trial court judges. And on these questions, especially one, there's a case that hurt certain public corruption prosecutions. I think people who have had some political experience, so long as it doesn't make them, crazy partisans, is really important in the court. Like how life works in the give and take and the hustle and bustle of politics. And I think Sandra Day O'Connor had that and brought a perspective to the court that was really important. So you'd like to see people who've had not just more women, but people who've had different kinds of experiences before getting to the court. And another thing that you'll never see, and that is appointing people to the court without 100% knowing with great accuracy how they're going to decide every issue. You have a little less independence because presidents are being very, very, very cautious in who they appoint, knowing that they want to maintain a certain kind of balance on the court.
Even still, you could never have predicted that Justice Roberts would vote to uphold the Affordable Care Act.
No,
right?
So there remain some surprises.
You have called, this is a question from the audience, you have called Rikers a place where, this is a quote, where brute force is the first impulse rather than the last resort, a place where verbal insults are repaid with physical injuries, and where beatings are routine while accountability is rare. So after your office's report, you achieved a settlement with the city of New York that required sweeping changes to Rikers Island and contributed to reforms of jails and prisons across New York. It's a long question. Mayor Bill de Blasio also announced a plan to close the prison at Rikers. How do you feel about the plan to build smaller jails in all the boroughs that are closer to courthouses? And do you feel that civil rights of inmates will be protected better this time around?
So thanks for the question. Just by way of background, in all this discussion about how prosecutors' offices think about what they pursue and think about communities of color and think about underprivileged folks and think about overlooked people and who needs the help of a prosecutor's office, one thing that I'm most proud of, and I have the second to last chapter of the book is about this, is how much effort we made to protect the rights of inmates at Rikers Island, which I think I describe in one of the first sentences of the chapter as basically a broken hellhole, because there's way too much violence. There's way too much resort to force as the first option as opposed to a last resort. And so I'm very proud not only of the fact that we entered into a suit and got a consent decree and got 7,000 more cameras and better disciplinary rules and better training mechanisms and all sorts of things for a population of people, by the way, that a lot of politicians really don't care about and hadn't cared about. And and the prior administration had not done much about at all. But not only that, but also, for the first time, I think, in a decade, bringing very serious, hard-hitting prosecutions against correction officers who had engaged in violence against inmates, vulnerable inmates who were, in jail pending trial. It's really hard to reform a culture like that. And I'm very honest in the book about saying sometimes that takes something more radical than just putting in more cameras so that there are fewer places where guards can visit violence upon inmates. And so I think, in answer to your question, I think all things should be considered. Maybe you shut down the place. Maybe you break it up. I was talking to people recently who worked on that case because I invited one of them to a class I teach here at NYU. And, sometimes a bad culture can get embedded into a place sort of like asbestos baked into the walls, and you have to do something radically different. So, I'm not proclaiming necessarily that that's the right thing to do, but I think it deserves very, very serious attention.
This is sort of a fun one. I think I know the answer because I read your book. If you hadn't been fired by Trump, would you have continued to work for the administration?
It's hard to see how I could have lasted. I think if I wasn't fired that day, I would have been fired at various other junctures along the way. I don't know. Part of the reason, it depends on whether or not if the dude had stopped calling me or not.
But you made a decision after you went to his pad.
Yeah, so I went to
stay working for him.
Yeah, and I'll tell you why I did. And hopefully this makes sense because people scratch their heads like, what are you talking about? You knew. And we had a family meeting. My kids thought, I told them that Donald Trump wants to meet with me to keep me on. And my kids thought that was like the funniest dad joke of all time. And I'm like, no, it's true. And they're like, what? So I understood my job to be not serving the president. Barack Obama had a photo opportunity with all the United States attorneys back in, I don't know, it was 2011 or 2012. And some of my colleagues have posted this on Twitter. And it's really unbelievable when you think about it in the current environment. Joyce Vance, my very good friend, who you might see on MSNBC from time to time, the Northern District of Alabama, she posted this. And so we had this photo opportunity, and the President of the United States comes out, the former president, who never called me, thankfully. And he says, and he congratulates us on our service, and he thanks us for our service. That's all of us, everyone, Pat Fitzgerald, Joyce Vance, me, everyone. And he says, I just want you to know, I appointed you, but you don't serve me. You don't answer to me. You don't work for me. You work for the public, and your loyalty is to the Constitution. How refreshing is that? Right? And by the way, there were no cameras there. There's no television there. There's no court reporter there. That's like what he thought and what he felt. And it's hard to explain to you how proud it made you feel to be serving. We knew that. That's how I think about the job. But to hear the president say it is really extraordinary. And then you hear this president say the opposite thing. And so when I agreed to meet with Donald Trump, I had a little speech. I had a little sermon I gave. I said, presumably, you're asking me to stay because you appreciate and respect the work that this office has done and how it has been independent and how we don't care about. I had to say those things on the record. And then I expected, and maybe naively, at least with respect to the president, to be kind of unmolested in my job. And then he was calling me, and my view is that he thought he thought it was important to cultivate a relationship with certain kinds of people, including the FBI director, Attorney General, and also the U.S. attorney in the jurisdiction where he has a lot of business and a lot of interests. And so I thought, it's related to your question, how could you possibly work in an administration where you don't agree with the policies of the president and don't, maybe he wasn't your guy, which he was not. You can do it if you're independent and you're left alone to manage your affairs and manage the affairs of the district in the way you think is right and just. And I wasn't given an opportunity. Look, at the first test of that, when he called, didn't return the call, and I was asked to go. So it's a weird hypothetical question you ask, because I think it was important to him to cultivate a relationship with the person in that job. And so I don't know how much longer.
So if he hadn't, I think what you're saying is,
if he had left me alone,
called you, if he had left you alone, you would have done it.
If he had left me alone, and I was never asked, look, Sally Yates got fired because she took a principled position that she thought was right under the law and the facts. and they fired her for that. So I had no illusions after that there could come a moment that Steve Miller, Vice President Steve Miller, when he decides to impose some nutso policy, that says no Muslims ever, and if my office were asked to defend that, I had no illusion that there might come a time where I might have to do the kind of thing that Sally or some other people did, and that I might not be able to last. But in the absence of those things, if I were left alone, never asked to do something that I wasn't supposed to do, I think I would have continued in the job because I'm a political appointee, but the people in my office, they're not. I have no idea what their party affiliations are. You don't ask that. You don't care about that. You're not allowed to ask that. You don't want to ask that. The bulk of work done by these U.S. attorneys' offices around the country, notwithstanding this, all this turbulence about Trump and lock her up and lock him up, most cases that are handled, there can be controversies like we've been talking about tonight, based on what makes sense in the interest of justice, but they're not political. Robbery, even the public corruption cases really aren't so political so long as everyone understands that you don't give a damn if you're a Republican or a Democrat. You follow the law, you follow the facts. And so that's how it's always been. I don't know that George Bush didn't call the United States Attorney in the Southern District of New York or in Texas. So you can do the job if you're left alone, and you're not asked to do something that's political. And all the people who are doing these jobs in all these offices around the country, it didn't matter. Look, I started as an assistant U.S. attorney when George W. Bush was president. I'm sorry, in 2000. Who's president in beginning of 2000? Bill Clinton. When Bill Clinton was president, and I remember as a young prosecutor, and then George Bush became president, my job didn't change at all. There was no difference. At some point, they switched out the pictures of the president and the vice president in the lobby of 1 St. Andrews Plaza, but the massive work, and there are exceptions to this, like the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice, it's different, depending on who the president is and what the policies are. But the vast majority of work that's done doesn't change.
So I'd like to end this with an anecdote that you tell at the end of your book, because your book is called Doing Justice, and it's about, people, hopefully good people, making ethical decisions, moral decisions, in order to implement and work through the mechanics of the justice system. But you tell a story at the end, and you mentioned the Muslim ban, at the end of your book, in the context of going beyond justice, about the first few days after 9/11, when a white supremacist in Texas decided to take it upon himself to take vengeance upon Muhammad Atba and Al-Qaeda, and to go in
I think the phrase he used was, he thought, Anthony Michael Stroman, who said it was his duty to kill some Arabs.
So he succeeded. He killed 2 Arabs, and then he walked into, this is in Texas, then he walked into a Texaco mini mart and shot Raz Bayan in the face with a shot-off double-barreled shotgun and left him to die, except for that he didn't die.
He did not.
And this gentleman survived after a series of surgeries. He lost most of his vision in one eye, but he was a devout Muslim, prayed 5 times a day, and after healing and getting his life back together, thought about the person who tried to kill him and decided to forgive him. And he mounted a campaign to spare Stroman's life, who at that point then was on death row in Texas.
Yeah.
Can you tell the rest of that story?
You've told most of it.
Because I have well.
No, I look. So, can I take one step back quickly?
Yeah.
So a theme of the book and a theme of my time as the U.S. Attorney is, yes, we are a nation of laws, not men, and that's important. And it has it's a bedrock principle of our constitutional democracy and of orderly society. But what you miss in that formulation, we talked about at the beginning, is that people do justice. And you can have a perfectly written constitution and a perfectly written statute, and if the people who are responsible are not, ethical and have integrity and are acting in good faith, and even if they are sometimes, as has been, discussed here with respect to me and others, you're not going to get justice. But the people matter, and liberty and justice live in the hearts and minds of men and women, And I have this whole book about stories of how the law works, even though the law has limits. And then I end with a story, as you say, because there are things that the law can't do. The law can't cause you to forgive people. The law can't cause you to love people. The law can't cause you to appreciate your neighbor. The law can't teach you grace. I think the first line of the chapter is you will not find God or grace in formal legal principles, and you don't. And if you really want something beyond formal legal justice, which is not coextensive with justice generally, then you have to look to extraordinary people. And that extraordinary person is Ray Bouillon, who you mentioned. And he gets shot in the face, and you mentioned he's a devout Muslim, and he still has pellets lodged in his forehead. And when he prayed 5 times a day, touched his head to the ground, he felt pain and a reminder of almost being murdered by Mark Anthony Stroman. And so he launches this camp, not only forgives him, which how many of you would do that, and then tries to spare him from death row in connection with the murder of someone else after 9/11. The New York Times did an interview with Mark Anthony Stroman, who's on death row, and asked him what he thought. And it turns out that even on death row, Stroman had learned of the campaign by this person he tried to kill, who was trying to save his life. And he was asked, what do you think? What do you make of that? And Stroman says things like, hate has to end. Hate does a lot of damage in the world. And he said how much he appreciated that there was a man whose life I tried to end is now trying to save mine. And then those were among his last words. And then he was executed. So
was justice done there?
Well, so I say, I'm not a proponent of the death penalty, but that was the law in Texas. And so I say formal justice, whatever that is, the machinery of justice unfolded and ground on, and that was done. But I think there's a more important lesson than whether the formal machinery of justice ground on in the way it was supposed to under the law, and that is that you had an inspiring example of a person who was shot in the face, left for dead, who decided that this other person who had tried to kill him and killed other people was capable of redemption, and in the process elevated himself from victim to kind of hero and transformed the very person who had tried to kill him. And that's a lesson for everyone who relies too much on formal notions of justice, that if we actually want society and the country and communities to live in harmony and to believe in something called cosmic justice and have people get along and appreciate each other no matter who you are, what your color is, what your background is, you're not going to get that from a cold statute, although that can have a role. You're going to get that from learning to overcome lots of human failings that you have, like Ray Bouillon did about that person. And I could think of no more inspiring example to end the book with than the story of Ray Bouillon and Mark Anthony Stroman.
I think with that, we're going to end it there. Preet Bharara, thank you very much for being here. Thank you for your book. The book is Doing Justice.